That's at the Gadfly MCN. And we also created a Facebook page as well. So, check this out. That way you can stay tuned with us and our different platforms. And very excited today to be joined by London Paul of the SeriousReport.com, and also have Ken Shortgun Jr. of ShotgunEconomics.com. So, gentlemen, good morning. How are the both of you doing today?
Morning, CJ. Morning, Paul. Morning, everyone.
Yes, morning, gentlemen. Yeah, very well. And yourself?
We're doing great. And Paul, we started a conversation about a week and a half ago and talking about the various content that's out there. And it's a struggle through this time period just because COVID currently is, 24/7 news cycle. And therefore, a lot of commentary coming from just the new media as well as the traditional media. And I think it's important through this time period and what we're navigating through is to also look for solutions through the chaos that are going to make a difference as people are trying to, figure out what's happening, what's going on, and to prepare for this transition period that we're all experiencing collectively as a society. So, Ken, Paul, any thoughts on that? And either one of you want to go first?
I'll go ahead and jump in. One of the fascinating things that I'm noticing is that at first there was a lot of rebellion against the governors and the mayors in the states. A lot of criticism about locking down the businesses, about wearing masks and that. But since as we go into August, and it's been about 4 months, I am really starting to see all across the country people capitulating en masse. I mean, there's a huge portion that are so obsessed with wearing masks, and if you don't wear masks, going after you. What this also tells me is, there was a similar situation back in the 1918 to 1920 Spanish flu, also, and in the 1958 Asian flu, is that once they started implementing the sort of both preventative and fear tactics, a combination of both, even after the threat was gone, people for a number of years afterwards followed that suit. They wouldn't associate with each other. Neighbors stayed away from each other just out of this fear that even though the official said that the virus was done, that it wasn't really done and you could catch it in some capacity. And, what they're doing, there's so many different psychological effects. I mentioned, I think in a podcast, maybe with Paul or previously last week, is that over a 30-day period from like June 5th to July 5th in California, more people died of suicide than they did of COVID. So you're starting to see this mental breakdown, and you're also starting to see this sort of anti-neighborly, people just seeing their neighbors as almost enemies. And then we have, of course, what's going on with the teachers union, even though the statistics out there that children of school age, they may be getting it, but they're not getting it at the same levels as adults because they don't have the respiratory problems. They're also not having the mortality rates, but the teachers unions are pretty much saying we're not going to teach. And that's going to, of course, force parents to have to find new alternatives. And interesting enough, more and more it's coming out, parents that are actually teaching their kids to finish out the last school year have found that the kids are learning far more at home than they did under the education system. So I think we're going to see, even if this ends in any relative time soon, I think there's paradigm shifts that have already been entrenched, and it's going to be fascinating to see what comes out of that.
Yeah, Ken, very, very well said, and great observations in terms of what's taking place. Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm with Ken a bit on this, and we had an experience of this where obviously things in the UK have started to open up, and I mean, they're obviously not. I think most things are open up. Okay, there's some restrictions in place and whatever, but we went to a pub for lunch on Monday, which is open. I think they opened, was it the middle of July? They just sort of opened. And the thing we found most interesting was the fact there was literally nobody there. I mean, okay, they've taken quite a lot of the tables out, so they've got people, so-called socially distancing. But there was literally, I think, there was us, there was a table that had about 4 people on, and there was another table there was 2 old guys having a drink together, and that was it essentially. And of course, when I went to order the food, I started chatting to the bar staff and went, okay, it seems like people are fearful. I know, okay, where I live has got a lot of older people. There's a lot of people in their 80s, 90s, and even 100 plus. And the interesting thing is, they said, yeah, a lot of people are still very fearful. There's a lot of people who, because things aren't how they used to be, where they used to like to stand at the bar and chat with people, they can't do that, so they don't want to come in. And I think Ken's hit the nail on the head. Even if tomorrow they said the virus was gone, a lot of people are going to spend a long time before they're going to actually normalize their life. If it all just, the taps were turned off tomorrow and everyone went back to what it was before they started. And there's a lot of people who are going to be extremely anxious and nervous about doing this. And it's certain age groups. It might be certain people in certain health categories and groups of people, and unfortunately this is an inevitability that it has created fear in people, and you can understand to some extent why that's true. I mean, the actual thing of going to the pub and having something to eat, essentially it was pretty normal. I mean, I didn't, the fact that I suppose that it was empty was the thing that was most abnormal, but the process of going there and ordering food and eating food and doing things just wasn't drastically different. Okay, yeah, there's some cosmetic things, but nothing that you would think that, well, this has completely ruined the fact we've gone and done this. But I think there is the long-term psychological impact is going to be significant, and I think the problem is as well is that there's going to be a long-term impact on people for a whole bunch of reasons, because there's a lots of different perspectives as to what's going on and why it's happening. And some of them are extremely divisive, they're extremely unhelpful, and that's caused a lot of upset and anguish and anxiety in people. And overall, the UK has got this kind of very strange kind of attitude, because on the one hand, Johnson's going, well, maybe by Christmas everything will be pretty normal. And then you've got these people coming out going, well, this thing might last for years, it might keep coming back, and blah, blah. And I think the truth of the matter is that they don't know what they really still at this point, they don't know what they're dealing with. They don't know the extent to which it might be a problem or isn't a problem. And it's because they are essentially in completely unfamiliar territory where they're now actually having to make decisions and say, well, what's in the best interest of people? And frankly, they don't seem to be capable of making the right decision and weighing up the economic benefits, the impact on people's, or the psychological impact and how it's affecting people, and saying, well, okay, on this basis, yeah, how many cases do we have, but what's the mortality rate in relation to this, and how do we react to this accordingly? And the thing is, they're not getting any of this right, and as a consequence of this, they're making horrendously bad decisions. And I always come back to the point that it's not always, people always think things are nefarious. A lot of it's just incompetence, and they're simply incapable of making the right decisions. I mean, we have people concerned in the UK, and there was a petition raised about vaccinations, and the government came out and said, well, you do realize that it's illegal to have mandatory vaccinations in the UK. Then they've come out about the whole track and trace thing and go, well, actually, we've discovered it's unlawful. Oh, by the way, we've suddenly realized that there might be, errors, or there are errors in how many cases we've concluded that people, died as a result of the virus. They're coming out and admitting things, mistakes, or confirming the anxiety people had about things. And this just proves that on many sides of the equation, there's misunderstanding, but there's also an admission. I mean, for the government to come out and say, well, we think we've miscalculated the number of deaths. And that proves they're not trying to hide things. They're actually just making big fundamental mistakes. Because frankly, that's what governments do. Yeah, there's always nefarious things in the world, and we're not disputing that. But fundamentally, governments are just full of useless, incapable people who can't make the right decisions, don't go, hang on a minute, we need to have some clear protocol that says, well, if somebody comes into hospital with some long-standing health issues and they may be diagnosed with the virus, well, maybe it's not helpful to diagnose them as having the virus on the death certificate. Equally, there's situations there where someone has the coronavirus, they may go home, and then they may have an underlying problem 6 months later or 3 months later, they pass away. And they're going, well, that just means they died of the coronavirus. I mean, these are nonsensical things. Doesn't mean it's necessarily some nefarious plan. It's just crassly ridiculous way of accounting for who has passed away legitimately, or for want of a better word, of the virus, and not so. And we have to be, and this of course causes a huge anxiety amongst people as well, because if they're overestimating things, then people say, well, hang on, we need to have a proportionate response to this. So, and as I said to you, CJ, before we came up, I don't doubt there are people trying to profit from this. It's irrefutable. But just because people are trying to profit from it doesn't mean it's nefarious. There's always going to be somebody or groups of people somewhere in any situation who'll try to make, extort money or try to in some way profit from it. It's happened throughout history. I mean, there was people doing it during World War II. And major wars and conflicts and all sorts of situations. So, but it doesn't make it nefarious. It doesn't mean that overall there's some big fundamental plan in place that's trying to create situations to benefit small groups of people, when you're trying to say that involves 200 countries and millions of people in health professionals, and they're all in on something. It's impossible. It just simply can't work that way. But we know fundamentally the UK's handled it wrong in some ways. There's no doubt the US has, and no doubt other nations have. And the problem is, we can't have a discussion where we actually say, okay, there are fundamental problems, and where's the people who you can galvanize and get a coherent response to this, and say, hang on a minute, we don't agree with this, but the problem is we don't have that. You just have lots of people with lots of different ideas, and something is going to have to give, because I was only saying to Lisa the other day, if they keep this up and say, well, we might need to keep vaccinating people every year, and there might need to be new vaccines, and I'll say, well, okay, if you're really serious about doing this, how are people ever going to function normally? And do you not understand the consequences of doing it? And the problem is, on a fundamental level, they don't even think this through at all. And it's very clear from responses in the UK that there's no coherent understanding. And to expect politicians to have some response to this based on what they're told, and clearly there's been huge errors in that, notably when they first came out with models which have been completely proved to be inaccurate. So, but the psychological aspect, I think, is enormous. But there's been some benefits. People don't want to work in offices. People are moving out of city. People are changing their attitude towards, like you said, Ken, with education, and starting to go, hang on, maybe we need to approach education differently. So, people, from my perspective where I live, people are pretty good. Everyone's getting on okay. And I haven't seen any degradation in that regard. I mean, the mask thing, well, in 2 days, if you go in a shop, you're supposed to wear a mask. You don't have to wear it anywhere else. So we'll see when masks start to become enforced in shops, whether that changes people's attitude. Although when I say enforce, I think even the police have admitted they can't enforce it, and because it's impossible. But probably waffled on a bit too long. But yeah, there are consequences for what's gone on, and they need to understand more the psychological damage and that it's doing to people.
The mental health, the anxiety is something that just really cannot be underestimated in terms of the impact on society and what we're witnessing. And I'll never claim, to be an expert, but, kind of firsthand, seeing and observing this, and even prior to, the lockdown. And gentlemen, I think I've shared, for the most part, we've been really trying to make a concentrated effort to get back in the gym and be healthy, eating healthy, and all the aspects of health. And I always looked at my gym time as being, very isolated. That, hey, I want to get in and get my time in and get done in and out. And I never really placed a value on conversations while there, because I looked at it more as an interruption or distraction to what I was doing. And there was one day that made me to rethink that. I was at the point where there was an elderly gentleman, veteran, and he was actually in a walker, and he was there, and he was trying to get his workout in. And I noticed he was having just a minor problem adjusting one of the pieces of equipment. So I helped him to adjust it, and I had to take my headphones out, and so it started this brief conversation, and it continued. And at the end of the conversation, he kind of chuckled, and he said, I really don't come here to get a whole lot of workout done. I just come here more to socialize and talk with people. This is where I get that. And it made me really pause and reflect upon that, and to think of where we are now, where we're being so disconnected, we're being placed into these social media platforms where we're engaging and having most of our conversations. And because, again, people out of fear, they may not be venturing out. And I think the dangerous, Chris, I think, is our youth, right? And thinking about taking them out of the social interactions in schools, which is so valuable for their development. They're thinking something that perhaps they can or cannot get in front of a computer doing e-learning. But I do want to share real quick. One of my friends, and I've known him for a long time. He's not going to mind me sharing this post. Had a great post today, and let me go find it real quick. So here we go. So I want to read this real quick, because I think it speaks volumes, and it's a great observation. So his name's Don Wettrick, and Don goes in his post to say, hey, I won't go into details, but I've been talking to a lot of former students this week, especially from the Franklin and Greenwood days. By the way, Don's a great educator, started up a foundation. While many are fine, I'm concerned about the general mood and welfare of people in their 20s. It's really hard out there, loss of jobs, COVID, so much division. In a time when we are all connected, many feel alone. I want to have more conversations in person or on the phone. It feels better to hear the joy or anger or stress and to be able to talk. Here's my request for my friends in their 30s and 40s. Take some time to possibly help a younger coworker or neighbor, listen to their struggles, and have an open mind about their situation. Remember the days when you were just starting out, not in the days of the pandemic or record high college debt. You may have had some perspectives, or even make some introductions to people or organizations that could help. They might be impressed that the stereotypes of Gen X and boomers isn't you. Then you'll find that our youth isn't what is being portrayed on TV. Connecting with people is real. Social media and its divisions of algorithms is what is fake. In my heart, the biggest obstacles can pave the way to the greatest opportunities. Now is the perfect time to help one another. And I just think that speaks volumes, and great post as to why we're here and trying to work to find solutions through this, gentlemen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting what you were talking about, the example of the old guy at the gym. Here in Arizona, Phoenix is one of the retirement capitals, sort of like the way Florida is, the villages. I mean, we have an entire city created, Sun City, from the 1960s for retirees to come here. We have just hundreds of gated communities, over 55 gated communities. And my mom is in one. And one of the things that I observed in there is it's almost like high school in over 55 gated communities. The cliques, the number of different cliques and divisions and separations that people get into, it was just astounding. It's almost like you go from a time as a kid where you have that peer pressure and that breaking into different cliques of like-minded people. And then when you get into the adult world, everybody's expected to be able to socialize and work with everybody else. And then when you retire like that, you go back to your like-minded areas and you pretty much ignore everybody else. I've got this, I was thinking a lot on the division. There's so many ways that they're dividing us here in America. And, even after the COVID, even after, whatever comes from the currency, the financial reset, it's going to take generations, at least one or two, to change the mindset of people from the divisions that have been created. I mean, obviously we have something, Asheville, North Carolina. The city legislature comes out and says, "Oh, we've approved reparations, $780 billion." Well, guess what? One, the state of North Carolina is not going to pay for it. Two, the federal government is not going to pay for it. So what's the point? Virtue signaling. If everybody's going to be virtue signaling, and this is, I don't know when political correctness actually started. I think it was the late 1980s or something. But we've gone 30 years, 30 to 40 years of creating or changing the language where people can't communicate with each other. Sometimes you have to get blunt and you have to get in somebody's face if they're not going to listen. Likewise, you also have to be have empathy and compassion when you listen to people, because some of them want to improve their, the cards that they've been given in life, and other people just want to complain and bring people down to their level so they won't be the only one miserable. But with that being said, I'm starting to see really, and it's my biggest fear, is not just the financial side, not just the epidemic or pandemic side, but we're really starting to see a breakdown in civilization, especially here in the West. And something like that, you really can't recover from.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's
good.
no, I agree, and it comes back to this problem that we're at this cusp in civilization where, I've said as much as anything, it's a reboot of humanity. Yes, there's all the financial aspect and economic things and geopolitical things, and everything that's unfolding is important, but it's as much a reboot in how humanity conducts itself, how it interacts with each other, how it behaves. I mean, we're in the 21st century, and sometimes I think we're still behaving like Neanderthal man, and it's staggering to think that humanity isn't made the progress it should do. But the thing is, we need to start in the West. We need to start having long-term plans. We can't have a government system that has this merry-go-round and revolving door every 4 years in the US or 5 years here, when nothing's ever achieved. There's no desire. There's no reason. It's just all about winning an election and not actually doing anything in the process. We have to start to say, well, where do we want Britain or the US to be in 20, 30, 50, and 100 years? And people say, well, that's ridiculous. Well, it isn't, because it's important that we make decisions now that are going to have long-term benefits and hopefully not too many consequences for future generations. If we keep thinking about what we need to do today and forgetting about tomorrow, we're never going to change. Nothing is going to materially change. And as you rightly allude to, Henry, you're talking generations, and at the minimum, it's probably going to take 10 to 20 years to affect. Doesn't mean things won't happen, but to get to a point where we feel like we've really made some progress could take that long. And then we've just got to keep working at it and keep making changes and keep evolving. Otherwise, the wheels will all fall off again, and that and we have to find a way of saying, well, we want to have whatever we term democracy or whatever we imagine it is, but we need to have a system that also says, well, there has to be long-term plans, and we have to start to put things in place, and don't have a government that notionally rolls something out and the next one comes in and goes, well, I'm just gonna tear that up because the other party did it. Whether it's feasible, whether it's right, whether it's wrong is not the issue. There needs to be some long-term goals, and And this has to be in all walks of life. But fundamentally, unless this change happens, then we're just going to be stuck in this perpetual rut for generations. There's no doubt there's going to be a fundamental mindset change, and I do already detect, ironically, in people we've interacted with, it's the people who you probably, no disrespect to them, but would least expect to have a grasp and an understanding. And I'm very encouraged by this, by some of the people we've interacted with. Not, I mean, in real, in real life situations. Like when we went in the pub, and obviously they were serving me, and I was chatting to the staff, and we're talking about what's been going on, and I was greatly enthused by how they spoke and what they spoke about now and the future, and it was clear. And they said it's clear things are changing, and that's greatly encouraging. So and I think sometimes in this world of social media or alt media, there are a very small group of people compared to the enormous world population or population of the US, UK. When you interact with people who don't use it, don't know anything about it, but a lot of them have a really good, solid grasp of what needs to change, and a recognition that things aren't working, and it's clear, we're in this period of great change, and they might not understand things to an appreciable extent, but they recognize it needs to change, and they want it to change, and to change in a positive way. And I feel sorry that is more commonplace than we think. And at the end of the day, the truth of the matter is, and there's a lot of people in the alt media world who are going to have to reformulate how they think about things and what they perceive the future to be, because I think they've got unrealistic expectations as to what they think is going to happen and how quickly it's going to happen. And at the end of the day, this isn't about being right or wrong. It's not, bragging rights to sit there and go, well, I know better than you. The issue is we have to get everybody to pull in the right direction. So we're going to have to find consensus and to break all these divisions down and say, well, it doesn't matter what political persuasion you are. We're in a different world now. It doesn't matter anymore. What do we need to do to make the world a better place for our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren, so on and so on? So what are we going to do to make the world a better place? So in 100 years and 200 years, people can turn around and go, that was the defining moment when things changed for the better. And okay, if we're not here, it doesn't matter. In a way, we're the kind of the gatekeepers for the future, and we might not reap the benefits of it. Well, so what? If we're there to spend the next 20, 30 years making it a better world, let's just do that. Because it's, otherwise, what's the point? We're just going to just sit there and allow this same cycle of insanity to keep happening. And I don't think it will happen, but if we're all on the same page, pulling in the same direction, it'd be a lot quicker and a lot easier, smoother passage. And I mean, if people don't realize, I mean, I don't want to get political on this particular thing, but just look at the behavior of Britain and the US recently with regards to China and Russia. If people aren't looking at this and seeing the reality of it by now, they're never going to, because frankly, they're both behaving so ridiculously, so childishly. And if people in nations don't wake up and see the reality to this, I don't think they ever will, because the UK's behavior with regards to Russia lately is just embarrassing. It's in fact, it's beyond embarrassing. And that's because of just how Western society or the Western structure of governance, etc., is now failed. This is just indicative. Well, we need to get past this and go, do you know what? I don't care what you think. I don't care about the past. I want to engage with Chinese and Russian people. I want us to build world consensus and come to global decisions that benefit every nation. And I'm not interested in your brand of hypocrisy, your brand of propaganda. I mean, we need to get past this, and we need to show political entities that whatever their crazy ideas are, don't marry the views of what we do. But all I see is people jumping on the anti-China, anti-Russia bandwagon, and but then that's what we perceive in social media. That's what we see in the alt media or elements of. But if you talk to people out there who don't engage in it, they go, "No, I don't believe this is nonsense," and that's the encouraging thing. So I think I don't want to just base my observations of the future on what is a very small subsection of humanity, because a lot of people don't interact in alt media or in social media to any appreciable extent. But I'm encouraged that they see things differently, but we need to build that consensus. And as you say, CJ and Ken and I have had conversations the same thing. We need to start to say there needs to be a consensus where we build something on the basis that there are great people all around the world, and let's you can build a virtual community, online community of people all over the world who share common ideas and aspirations, and say this is the future, not your crazy governance mechanism, which is never been anything other than self-serving, and certainly not to serve the interest of people like you and I.
Yeah, very very well said, Paul. Yeah, that's the challenging thing is people to understand we at one point we used to talk about the middle of the road, and now what that's really changing so much, where now there's no middle of the road, and how do we dial back to that, and I'm confident because we're not the only ones that are having these conversations in regards to doing solutions based content, solutions based media. There's a lot of people trying to help educate with some of their podcasts, some of the information that they're sharing. And I know for our Gadfly subscribers and our community, we've kind of explored ideas of how do we do that? How can we impact? And we don't have all the answers. We don't want to pretend that we do. And we're thinking about having a format where we can do a Zoom session with our Gadfly subscribers, and bring people in and share ideas and come up with some of these things for the benefit of good, because I think now is a time, and I'm confident that we can get through this. We're starting people to explore ways of creating new things, creating ideas, and we may not be able to be just idly, stand by and wait. The last thing we want to do is wait for the government to create these solutions. It may more impactful to work within your community to create some of these things. And, whether it's the economic struggle that's going to be occurring or the political landscape within your community, but reaching out and finding a way to build bridges to help everyone. So I'm confident that we can make an impact on that, but it's going to take, more than people to just listening to this podcast or us here. It's going to be, how do we create these ideas? How do we foster them and sharing them? So, gentlemen, what other thoughts do you guys have right now in regards to building that community of finding solutions for our communities?
Well, the interesting thing, and I want to touch upon something that Paul mentioned. Back about 5-6 years ago, I created an axiom. Yes, I am egotistical sometimes, but really, it was an observation. And it's called Shorgen's Law of Laxity. And it goes, for every situation or circumstances that is allowed to grow unfettered, it takes an equal proportion of time and or effort to correct that change or result. And if you take a look in history, change really occurs two different ways, sort of like the way Hemingway said about bankruptcy. How do you go bankrupt? First slowly, and then all at once. And that's the exact same thing. Usually, if things are allowed to go unfettered, leading to a finality, the only way change occurs is if it reaches that end goal over the course of years, decades, centuries even, or there's an event or a backlash all at once that creates the paradigm shift. A good example is in Europe in the late 1800s and leading up to World War I, everybody started buying and accumulating and stockpiling all these new modern weapons. Well, ask any army. If you have weapons, they have to be used. And eventually it led to a point where an event triggered and everybody wanted to go to war. The same thing we're starting to see come here today. We've had capitalism, well, I should say cronyism, creditism here in the United States and in the West, lead to major disparity, but wealth disparity, where there's the 1%, there's a really declining middle class, and then there's a large number of poor. That's going to lead to a conflict. We're seeing in the education system, people are doing 12, 16, even 20 years of education, but they're learning nothing. They're not gaining any knowledge. So there's no, all the systems we have in place. And what I'm alluding to and leading up to, I should say, was something that Paul and I, Paul made a statement about 3 weeks ago. He said, the U.S. Constitution needs to be redone. And of course, as an American and a constitutionalist and a patriot, the first thought in my mind was, the wall of defense come up. What the hell are you talking about? There's nothing wrong with the Constitution, except for the fact that after I got done with that knee-jerk reaction, I started thinking. I started critically thinking about it. And I realized that the Constitution was written at a time when there was only 13 colonies all connected to each other. It was a small country. There wasn't a great population. There wasn't the expectation that a centralized federal government would be doing more than perhaps dealing with trade and tariffs and protecting the borders, calling to war when it was necessary. But as we got more and more states, and we got bigger, and we got more different divisions, the East Coast, or one of the biggest things they don't talk about when it comes to the Civil War was that the South were the producers of raw goods, but the North were the producers of manufactured goods. All the textiles was up there, and the North was reaping far more profits off the backs of the South. And that was one of the big reasons why the South and the plantation owners desperately needed cheap labor, in this case, slaves. Had the South been the ones who were doing the manufacturing and having that productivity and getting more wealth, chances are good that they would have been more amenable and quicker to get rid of slavery. So the divisions as the country started expanding really showed that the Constitution, the way it was written in 1787 or ratified then, was not capable of a much larger construct, because every region of the country and every peoples in those regions had different needs and different requirements. And those in power on the East Coast really didn't care what was going on in the middle of the country or eventually the West, etc. So what really came to that part, we've seen this in California, in Colorado. There's talk of breaking California into 5 different states. There's talk about a secession movement in northern Colorado and southern Idaho. The fact of the matter is the country is too big to be run by a small, a centralized federal government. It needs to go back. When the Federal Reserve was first created, there were 12 regional district banks, and each one set the interest rates for their region. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco dealt with the gold mining of the Northwest. The one in Kansas City dealt with the meat packing plants. The one in Atlanta dealt with the cotton and other agricultural things. Okay, the interest rates necessary to run that economy in that small region, you had to have that division. Then eventually, as with all governments, and we see this with the European Union. The original concept of the European Union was following World War II, where a mining operation in Germany in the Ruhr, I think, got with manufacturing in France, and they got together and they created a contract, sort of a union, and it eventually blossomed. Well, now, just like with anything, power always wants to go to a centralized point. Pretty much the federal government thinks they can run everything in the country, and people have been programmed. I mean, look at this. We're not going to our local governments. We're like, oh, what's the federal government going to do to save us? People have this mindset, and then they think that they're going to create vote politicians to save them at the federal level. While in the meantime, they ignore the fact that most of their problems are due to the officials at the state level who you keep putting in office and he keeps screwing you. So I started really thinking, and the fact of the matter is the United States is just too big to be run by one central government. And if the Constitution at its basic form is fine, but it will only work in regions if the regions have autonomous power to deal with problems in that region. So, you want to talk about solutions, doing things the way we've been doing it, fighting each other to see who's going to be the next president, Hillary or Trump or Biden or Trump. And, the fact of the matter is, why aren't you looking at your local mayor? Why aren't you looking at your local police force? Why aren't you standing up and making change at the local level? All politics is local, and it starts there. And if you solve the problems at the local level, then you can solve the problems at the state level, and then you can solve the problems in your country.
Yeah, and hence I think that in terms of like even internationally, taking a look at that, what's occurring right now with the European Union, we are seeing an effort to move more towards a decentralized, type of management, and I think that the power of that lies in the community. Exactly what you said, Ken. I think that's a great message to to get involved. There are some other people that are trying to work and create solutions. One that I do want to share, and this is built on the Conscious Resistant Network, and basically it's called Freedom Cell. The freedomcells.org is looking to allow people to collectively come together in their communities to work together to find these types of solutions. Now, I just recently submitted for this and looking to create one here in my state just to see what it's about, see how it's working, to connect with like minds. But I will share my findings exactly, how that works, and how you can create networks within your communities of finding like-minded people to find the solutions. And we definitely will move forward with the conversation in regards to the Zoom session with Gadfly subscribers. And for those that are listening in to this public live stream, you can jump over to the gadfly.vhx.tv to start your free 30-day subscription if you want to begin and participate in that. I think it'd be a great opportunity to give our subscribers an opportunity. And we always see it in our forums, right? We're always seeing people post great articles, offering those conversations, and to come together and to be able to share those ideas, so that perhaps we can find a way to navigate through this. I think it's darn it, it's just so important. Paul, I know you significantly talk in regards to a lot of perspective regarding humanity, and I firmly believe that we can navigate through this and be successful. But if we're sitting here waiting for the government to create those solutions for us, it's not going to happen. It's going to lie within the community. So, gentlemen, any closing thoughts before we wrap up this session? I'll let Paul go first, and I'll turn it to you, Ken. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, well, I think so. I think we should have this Zoom session with our subscribers. I think it's great if they can interact with us. It might be interesting just for them to be able to voice their reasons for why they feel about certain things, and also it helps to clear up people's difference of opinion about things. And this is the way we have to. Fortunately, there used to be a time way back when people used to go to each other's houses and have real friends. I'm not saying people don't, by the way, but less so, and actually interact with people in a meaningful, real way. And increasingly, people don't interact, where I think that format is excellent for people to interact. Okay, admittedly, we're not all sat in the same room, but given it's an international audience, it's impossible to do that. And I think it's a great opportunity for people who have ideas and to start to build some consensus. I mean, what I will say with regards to the US now, I'm not saying this will happen, and it will, but probably a decade ago, I had a conversation with a couple of people with regards to the US, because for me, I sat down and said, look, it's obvious the dollar is going to capitulate at some point, and what's the understanding for the US? And they said there was a genuine belief at some point that the US would break up into 4 or 5. Not saying the United States ceases to exist, but it will break up into regions and maybe have regional governance on a more sort of federal level, for want of a better description. I mean, I'm just trying to emphasize how it might change. I'm not saying state level doesn't exist, but to try and break down this idea that you can have a nation of 4 million square miles run federally by a president, it clearly doesn't work. So there was an understanding that that was likely to happen for the US, and I think you can extrapolate that across the world. I think you'll see groups of nations who may join together, form different alliances, and they don't necessarily have to have geographical proximity even. I mean, you might have certain nations in Europe who form an alliance because there's a reason where it will benefit those in a collective sense, and you might find 20 nations of Europe can do this. I mean, but we have to absolutely move away. And I know partly why Europe was centralized is because there was a belief, well, it'll prevent World War III. We won't have any more wars if we centralize. And that it was part of the reasoning. I'm not saying there aren't nefarious reasons or anything, but that was part of the reasoning. But we have to get away from the fact we're not going to wage war in Europe with each other anymore. We've slightly evolved past that sort of primitive way of thinking, but we need to have European nations that can have sovereignty, they can interact and find common ground and work together for mutually beneficial reasons. And within nations, there's no doubt that I think you'll see certain regions who want more autonomy. I mean, obvious ones, Catalonia in Spain is a good example. I think there's regions of Italy. I could see Italy kind of having a different form of governance, and we have to accept that decentralization is the only logical way forward. It doesn't mean that nations collectively don't cooperate or cooperate with each other, but centralized governance just isn't going to work in the future, and it's not worked. And the definition of insanity is repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I think we're at that point where, okay, we're not saying we can affect that level of change, but if we can demonstrate, and the US is a great example, that there's people in various states who have good ideas, and it might be a business idea, it might be an idea of how states can work together, or things that should change within states, and we're going to have to start to say, well, okay, it hasn't worked in the past, we haven't had a say in anything, but if we're going to be affecting change, I don't see why 330 million Americans can't have a say in how things can be done differently. It's just people are either switched into the system and believes that's as good as it gets, or they actually really think this system benefits them, or they simply just don't believe it's possible to affect change. Well, there's always turning points in history where change comes about, and if you don't start, we'll never know if it will succeed. But I have a feeling that if groups of nations or people within nations form collectives and say, I don't care whether this person's from Russia or China or North Korea or Iran or wherever they are, but people have got good ideas and we want to form collectives and start to build, people to people relationships. Once we do that, that's going to break down enormous barriers. And I think we see enormous barriers within nations for a whole bunch of reasons, where you have different people from different social classes, who some of them just don't seem to want to interact with others. And I don't dispute that happens, particularly in Western nations, although not as appreciable as it used to be. But these are barriers that need breaking down, and we need to start to realize that the world is changing. And if we want it to change, we can be part of that change, and we shouldn't imagine that it's not possible to actually affect positive change. But if we sit there and say it's never going to happen, of course it will never happen. But I don't see why. There's always a starting point. It's from acorns, oak trees are grown. And I think that in 20, 30, 40 years, people can turn around and go, well, that was a big transition in history, probably the biggest we'll ever see. I think, arguably, I don't think we're in 1,000 years there'll be a bigger transition. That's how significant this is. So, let's plant some acorns and try to affect that change, because there's going to come a point when we're not going to talk anymore about this transition. The transition will have happened. And yeah, we're in the middle of it, and there's a lot still happening. There's a lot to talk about. But there's going to come a point where that doesn't apply anymore because we're through it. And then we're going to have to say, okay, well, what's the future? And we're not going to be talking then about, what we have in the past. And now's the time to start building communities, different ideas. And, and for us to get people, our subscribers, to come on, from wherever they are in the world. We've had some interaction with my own subscribers. There's some great people out there with trying to do some wonderful things where in all parts of the world. And you think, well, if they can do it, well, maybe maybe we can all learn from something, and people can start to adopt those techniques, strategies in different parts of the world, and start to say, well, maybe we can just build our way out of things by doing things ourselves and not worrying so much about what central government is going to do or not going to do. Because one thing's for certain is they're going to have an enormous period of chaos because they don't know what they're doing, and they're certainly not going to know what they're going to do in the immediate future. We need to start to have a meritocracy with people who are capable of actually not having heavy, but light touch governance. We're still going to need some form of governance for nations, because if you don't, the nation will collapse. But that doesn't mean it's onerous. But we need to start to have a situation where people feel confident that they can start to affect some change. And I don't doubt it's perfectly feasible to happen. And we need to start thinking about the future and starting to put some building blocks in place. And we see, to me, I see this as something to do for the rest of my life. I don't think, I'm not just going to give up on a year or two's time and go, well, that's the end of it. I think we need to realize we're custodians for a future in a different world, and we can all do what we feel we might be able to achieve in that regard. But don't ever think you can't do these things, or it's impossible, because it's not impossible, because there's going to be this enormous vacuum, and someone's going to have to fill the vacuum. Well, I think it's better 300 million Americans fill the vacuum and start to say, well, okay, we're going to have to think things through differently. We're going to have to be more innovative and plot our way through rebuilding the US, rebuilding the UK, rebuilding the West, and leaving a legacy for future generations. And I don't care if I don't live to see this, fulfill its true potential in the future. That's not the point. We're here to lay the foundations and to be part of this big change. And maybe we will see some benefit, but if we don't, who cares? This is about the future of humanity. It's not about us as individuals and how we can screw the system and benefit from it.
Very well said. Ken, go for it.
It shouldn't be surprising, or I should say it should not be something that should shock people. But if you take a look, the Messiah, Savior of the Christian religion, Jesus, he spoke on money more than any other topic except the kingdom of God. More than hope, more than love. Whenever we want to try to find the root problem of something, we always say, follow the money. When a nation is no longer under a sound and equitable monetary system, that's when most problems take place and occur. During the 1960s, we got through the civil rights era of the 50s, and just leading into when we started going off the silver and gold standards, African Americans, Black Americans were actually the leading segment of the economy that was growing. wealth-wise, salary-wise, and then when we went off the gold standard, went on a purely fiat currency standard, all of a sudden, that's when really destruction started taking place. The fact of the matter is that where people think of things as in terms of greed, wealth disparity, it's envy, unless you have a sound money system, you do not have freedom, you do not have an economy. And I guess it shouldn't be surprising as well that we have so many kids today wanting to become socialists and bring Marxism to the country, despite the fact that no system of Marxism has ever worked well in the world, period. Just the same way that there is no way that pure capitalism does. I guess my final, the thing I'm trying to say is, with everything rushing towards a new currency reset, and even going back to the biblical and Sumerian times, even before the Bible, the Sumerians had what was known as the Jubilee, because they knew that mankind would take and create an uneven balance when it comes to wealth. People need to realize that things will not change either in civilization itself, politically, socially, etc., until we get back to an equitable, sound money system. And hopefully that's what this whole thing we've got going is leading up to, because a sound money, a real money system that is equitable, will solve so many of these problems. We keep chasing the symptoms and the consequences of things, but we never get down to the root. Well, guess what? We've gone to the point where central banks around the world now are going to print to infinity. They will not stop. They've corrupted the system to the point that it's going to lead to an end of destruction. And when it does, it's going to be similar in many aspects to what happened to Europe when the Roman Empire fell. There was 1,000 years of darkness where people just scrounge day to day. It's not going to be that bad, but what's going to have to come out of it is a recognition that what we have now cannot be reformed. It cannot be remolded into some different type of product and sold that way. We've got to go back to the basics. And with that being said, that is my goal in helping educate people, is to recognize that sound money, sound relationships are the most important thing that we've got to go for, to have a civilization, as Paul said, where people look to each other as neighbors, as friends, rather than as adversaries or competition.
Yep, absolutely. Very well said. Gentlemen, thank you for a great conversation today. And for our Gadfly subscribers, again, thank you for supporting our multi-channel network. Drop comments directly here on this video or in our forums as well. And we will be posting and keeping everyone up to date as we plan the Zoom session, with our subscribers and those that are tuning in on the Gadfly live stream. If this is your first time listening, you can jump over again to the gadfly.vhx.tv to learn more about our subscription-based platform. Ken and Paul, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you, gentlemen, once again for a great conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, and a pleasure as ever, and to you too as well, CJ.